The dust cloud on the horizon meant only one thing. Another mail-order bride had arrived in Copper Ridge, and this one was about to change everything. Evangeline Washington stepped down from the stagecoach, her emerald traveling dress a stark contrast against the sun-bleached wooden platform. The Montana wind whipped her dark curls free from their careful pins as she surveyed the rough frontier town that was supposed to be her new home. 23 years old, educated in Boston, and born free in Philadelphia, she had never imagined she'd find herself responding to a matrimonial advertisement in a territory newspaper. But desperate times had called for desperate measures, and the promise of marriage to a prosperous rancher named Thomas Mitchell had seemed like salvation. What she hadn't expected was the silent figure watching her from the shadows of the general store, a man whose presence made her pulse quicken in ways that had nothing to do with nervousness. Before we continue with Evangeline's incredible journey, if you're enjoying this story, please hit that like button and subscribe to help me reach my first 50 subscribers. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more epic Western romance tales. Now let's get back to the story. Joseph Crow Feather had been watching the stagecoach approach for the better part of an hour, though he couldn't say exactly why. Perhaps it was the way the afternoon sun caught the dust, or perhaps it was something deeper, the same instinct that had kept him alive during his years as a scout for the cavalry, before he'd grown disgusted with their methods and struck out on his own. Now he worked odd jobs around Copper Ridge, keeping to himself, speaking only when absolutely necessary. But when the woman in green stepped onto the platform, every muscle in his body went taut. She was beautiful, yes, but it was more than that. There was something in the way she held herself, proud, determined, unafraid, despite being alone in unfamiliar territory. Her dark skin gleamed like polished copper in the sunlight, and when she turned her head, scanning the crowd for her intended husband, Joseph caught sight of eyes the color of warm honey. "You, Thomas Mitchell," called out Jake Brewster, the stagecoach driver hauling down a worn leather trunk. "Got your mail-order bride here." Joseph watched as several men stepped forward, but none of them was Thomas Mitchell, because Thomas Mitchell was currently passed out drunk in the back room of the Silver Dollar Saloon, where he'd been for the better part of 3 days, celebrating his upcoming nuptials with enough whiskey to fell a horse. Evangeline's smile faltered as minutes passed with no sign of her intended. The other passengers had been claimed by family or friends. The stagecoach had already rumbled away, and still she stood alone on the platform with her trunk at her feet and uncertainty creeping up her spine. "Excuse me," she called to a passing woman in a faded calico dress. "Do you know Thomas Mitchell? I'm supposed to be meeting him." The woman's face immediately darkened. "Oh, honey," she said, shaking her head. "You don't want to be mixed up with Tom Mitchell. That man's got more problems than a cat's got fleas." Before Evangeline could ask what she meant, a gruff voice cut through the air. "You the colored gal here to marry Mitchell?" She turned to see a red-faced man in a sheriff's badge approaching, his expression a mixture of disdain and amusement that made her stomach clench. "I am Miss Evangeline Washington, yes, and I am here at Mr. Mitchell's invitation." The sheriff, Henderson according to his badge, looked her up and down in a way that made her skin crawl. "Well, Miss Washington, I'm afraid Mr. Mitchell is currently indisposed. Has been for about 3 days now. Doubt he'll be in any condition to get married any time soon." The words hit her like a physical blow. She had spent her last $15 on the stagecoach ticket west. Her position as a seamstress in Boston had been eliminated when the factory closed, and with no family left after her parents' deaths the previous year, she had nothing to return to. "Where is he?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Silver Dollar," Henderson said with a smirk. "But I wouldn't recommend going in there if I were you. Not the kind of place for a lady of your particular circumstances." The emphasis he placed on particular circumstances made it clear he was referring to more than just her unmarried status. Evangeline felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she lifted her chin defiantly. She had dealt with men like Henderson before. "Thank you for the information, Sheriff," she said coolly. "I believe I can handle myself." It was then that she became aware of someone approaching from her left, a tall figure, moving with the fluid grace of a predator. When she turned, her breath caught in her throat. The man was Native American, probably Crow based on the beadwork pattern on his buckskin vest. His black hair fell past his shoulders, held back from his face with a leather cord, and his skin was the color of burnished bronze. But it was his eyes that stopped her cold, dark as midnight and intensely focused on her face, with an expression she couldn't quite read. He stopped a few feet away and spoke quietly to Sheriff Henderson in a voice like whiskey and smoke. "Mitchell's in no shape to claim anyone. Hasn't been sober in 3 days." Henderson's face reddened further. "Nobody asked you, half-breed. Why don't you mind your own business?" The stranger's expression didn't change, but something dangerous flickered in his dark eyes. "Someone should tell the lady what she's walking into." "And I suppose you think that someone should be you?" Henderson's hand moved to rest on his gun. "Last I checked, your opinion wasn't worth much around here." Evangeline had heard enough. She stepped between the two men, her patience finally snapping. "Gentlemen, I am perfectly capable of speaking for myself and making my own decisions. Sheriff Henderson, thank you for the information about Mr. Mitchell's whereabouts, and sir," she turned to the stranger, "I appreciate your concern." The native man nodded once, his gaze holding hers for a moment that seemed to stretch like taffy. Then he bent down, grasped the leather handles of her trunk with ease, and straightened. "Name's Joseph Crow Feather," he said simply. "Silver Dollars 3 blocks that way. But you might want to find yourself a room at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house first. Give Mitchell time to sober up before you make any decisions you can't take back." Before either Evangeline or the sheriff could respond, he was walking away, carrying her trunk as if it weighed nothing. After a moment of shocked hesitation, Evangeline hurried after him, leaving Henderson standing on the platform looking like he'd swallowed something sour. "Mr. Crow Feather," she called, catching up to his long strides. "You don't need to carry my things." He glanced down at her, and she was struck again by the intensity of his gaze. "Where else you planning to go?" It was a fair question. She had no money for a hotel room, no other contacts in town, and apparently no groom waiting to meet her. The reality of her situation was beginning to sink in, and it wasn't pretty. "I suppose Mrs. Patterson's boarding house sounds reasonable," she admitted. "Though I should warn you, I'm not exactly flush with funds at the moment." Something that might have been a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Mrs. Patterson's got a soft spot for strays. You'll figure something out." They walked in silence for a few minutes, past false-fronted buildings and hitching posts, dodging horses and wagons in the dusty street. Evangeline found herself stealing glances at her unexpected escort. He moved with unconscious confidence, as if he owned the ground he walked on, and she noticed that other people stepped aside to let them pass. Whether out of respect or fear, she couldn't tell. "Why did you help me back there?" she asked finally. Joseph was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "Didn't like the way Henderson was looking at you." The simple honesty of his response sent warmth spreading through her chest. "And how was he looking at me?" This time, Joseph stopped walking entirely and turned to face her. They were standing in front of a neat wooden building with a painted sign that read, "Patterson's Boarding House. Clean rooms, good food." But Evangeline barely noticed it, because Joseph's dark eyes were searching her face with an expression that made her feel like the most interesting thing he'd ever encountered. "Like you were something he could use up and throw away," he said quietly. "Some men see a woman alone and figure she's got no choices left. Henderson's one of those men." "And what kind of man are you, Mr. Crow Feather?" The question hung between them like smoke. Joseph set down her trunk and took a step closer, close enough that she could smell leather and sage and something uniquely masculine that made her pulse quicken. "The kind who thinks you've got more choices than you know," he said. "Question is whether you're brave enough to see them." Before she could ask what he meant by that, the boarding house door opened and a plump woman with graying hair appeared, wiping her hands on her apron. "Joseph Crow Feather, what are you doing standing in my front yard?" she called out cheerfully. Then her eyes fell on Evangeline and her expression grew curious. And who might this lovely young lady be? Mrs. Patterson, Joseph said, touching the brim of his hat. This is Miss Washington. She came in on the afternoon stage to meet Thomas Mitchell. Mrs. Patterson's face immediately creased with sympathy. Oh, my dear, I'm so sorry. Tom's been, well, he's been having some troubles lately. Are you all right? Do you have somewhere to stay? Evangeline straightened her shoulders. I was hoping you might have a room available. I'm willing to work for my keep. I'm an excellent seamstress and I can cook and clean. Of course, dear. Come inside and we'll get you settled. Mrs. Patterson bustled forward to usher Evangeline toward the door, then paused and looked back at Joseph. Will you be staying for supper? I'm making beef stew. Evangeline found herself holding her breath, waiting for his answer. Something about this quiet, intense man fascinated her in a way that was probably inappropriate for a woman who was technically still engaged to another. Thank you, ma'am, but I've got work to finish at the livery, Joseph replied. He hefted Evangeline's trunk again and carried it up the front steps, setting it down just inside the door. Then he turned back to her, and once again she felt that strange electricity when their eyes met. Miss Washington, he said formally, I hope things work out the way you want them to. And then he was gone, walking away down the dusty street with that fluid, predatory grace, leaving Evangeline staring after him with questions she couldn't name burning in her chest. Loving the tension between these characters? Hit that like button and subscribe. I'm on a mission to reach 50 subscribers, and you can help me get there. Every subscription counts now. Let's see what happens next. Mrs. Patterson turned out to be everything Joseph had suggested. Kind, practical, and more than willing to let Evangeline work for her room and board. Within an hour, Evangeline had been installed in a small but clean room on the second floor, introduced to the other boarders, and put to work helping with supper preparations. So you came all this way to marry Tom Mitchell, said Mrs. Patterson as they chopped vegetables in the kitchen. It wasn't quite a question. I responded to his advertisement in the Boston Globe, Evangeline replied carefully. He seemed respectable in his letters. Mrs. Patterson sighed. Oh, Tom can be charming when he wants to be. Trouble is, he wants to be less and less these days. Ever since his first wife died in childbirth 2 years ago, he's been hitting the bottle pretty hard. I'm afraid marriage isn't going to cure what's ailing him. Evangeline's hand stilled on the carrots she was dicing. His first wife? He didn't mention being widowed in his letters. Probably didn't want to scare you off. Tom's not a bad man, mind you, just a broken one. And broken men have a tendency to break other people if they're not careful. The word settled over Evangeline like a cold wind. She had escaped one difficult situation in Boston, only to find herself potentially trapped in another. The money she had saved for a new start was gone, spent on the journey west, and now she was hundreds of miles from anything familiar, dependent on the kindness of strangers. Mrs. Patterson, she said quietly, how well do you know Joseph Crowfeather? The older woman's face softened. Joseph? Known him for about 3 years now, ever since he started working around town. He's a good man. Quiet, hardworking, honest. Some folks around here don't trust him because he's Indian, but that says more about them than it does about him. She paused in her chopping and gave Evangeline a shrewd look. Why do you ask? He helped me today when I arrived. I was just curious about him. Mrs. Patterson's tone suggested she wasn't fooled. Well, I can tell you that Joseph's had his share of troubles too. Used to scout for the army before he got disgusted with their methods. Now he keeps to himself mostly. Does odd jobs. Helps people when they need it. Never seen him show much interest in courting, though I suspect that's more about opportunity than inclination. That evening, Evangeline found herself helping to serve supper to the boarding house guests, a mix of traveling salesmen, seasonal ranch workers, and permanent residents who couldn't afford their own homes. The conversation was lively, centered mostly around local gossip and speculation about the upcoming cattle drive season. It was nearly full dark when someone knocked on the front door. Mrs. Patterson went to answer it, and Evangeline heard a familiar voice asking if Miss Washington was available. Her heart began to race as Mrs. Patterson led Joseph into the dining room. He had cleaned up since the afternoon. His long hair was neatly braided, and he wore a clean white shirt under his buckskin vest. Several of the other diners looked up with curiosity, and she saw one man frown with obvious disapproval. "Miss Washington," Joseph said formally, "I wondered if you'd had a chance to speak with Mitchell yet." "No, I haven't," she replied, very aware that everyone in the room was listening. "Mrs. Patterson suggested I wait until tomorrow." He nodded. "Probably wise. I wanted to let you know. I asked around about his situation. Thought you should have all the facts before you make any decisions." "And?" Joseph's expression was carefully neutral, but she could see concern in his dark eyes. "He owes money all over town. Lost most of his cattle in a bad deal last winter, and the bank's threatening to foreclose on his ranch. Word is he's been looking for a way to get back on his feet, and a wife with some savings might seem like the answer to his problems." Evangeline felt her stomach drop. "I see, and how did you come by this information?" "Asked the right questions of the right people." His gaze held hers steadily. "Figured you deserved to know what you might be getting into." One of the other diners, a ranch hand with tobacco-stained teeth, spoke up. "Seems to me like this is between Miss Washington and Tom Mitchell. Don't see how it's any of your business, Indian." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Joseph turned to look at the man, and Evangeline saw something dangerous flicker across his features. "You're right," Joseph said quietly. "It's not my business. I was just trying to be helpful." "Well, maybe you should stick to helping your own kind." Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "That's enough, Garrett. This is my house, and I won't tolerate that kind of talk at my table." But the damage was done. Evangeline could see the shuttered expression that had fallen over Joseph's face, the way his shoulders tensed. He nodded politely to Mrs. Patterson, touched his hat brim to Evangeline, and headed for the door. Without thinking, Evangeline stood up. "Mr. Crow Feather, wait." He paused in the doorway, looking back at her with surprise. "Would you walk with me? I could use some fresh air." She saw something flicker in his eyes, surprise, wariness, and something else she couldn't name. Around the table, she was aware of shocked whispers and disapproving stares, but she didn't care. This man had gone out of his way to help her twice now, and she wasn't about to let him leave thinking his kindness wasn't appreciated. "If you're sure," he said quietly. "I'm sure." Mrs. Patterson handed her a shawl without comment, though Evangeline caught the approving look in her eyes. Then they were outside in the cool evening air, walking slowly down the wooden sidewalk, while stars began to appear in the darkening sky. "You didn't need to do that," Joseph said after they'd walked a block in silence. "Do what?" "Defend me, stand up for me, whatever you want to call it." Evangeline stopped walking and turned to face him. In the dim light from the windows they'd passed, his features looked carved from shadow and moonlight. "Yes, I did," she said firmly. "What that man said was inexcusable, and what you did, warning me about Mr. Mitchell, was kind. I won't apologize for recognizing kindness when I see it." Joseph studied her face for a long moment. "You know that most folks in this town won't see it that way. You being seen with me, especially at night. It'll cause talk. Let them talk." The words came out with more heat than she'd intended, surprising them both. "I'm tired of living my life according to what other people think I should or shouldn't do. It's what got me into this mess in the first place." "What do you mean?" Evangeline wrapped the shawl more tightly around her shoulders, suddenly feeling the need to explain herself to this quiet, intense man who seemed to see straight through to her soul. "I was working as a seamstress in Boston. Good position, decent pay, respectable employer. But the factory owner's son decided he wanted more from me than just fine stitching. When I refused his advances, he made life very difficult for me. Finally had me dismissed on trumped-up charges." She took a breath. "Everyone said I should have just accommodated him, that a woman in my position couldn't afford to be too particular." Joseph's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "And so you came west to marry a stranger." It seemed preferable to the alternatives. She looked up at him, taking in the sharp angles of his cheekbones, the way the starlight caught in his dark hair. Though I'm beginning to think I may have jumped from the frying pan into the fire. Maybe, he said quietly. Or maybe you just haven't found the right path yet. They had stopped in front of the general store, and Joseph leaned back against the wooden post supporting the overhanging roof. The movement brought him closer to her, close enough that she could see the pulse beating in his throat, close enough to catch his scent of leather and sage and something wild that made her think of mountain streams and endless sky. "What would you do?" she asked impulsively. "If you were in my situation?" His dark eyes searched her face. "I'd stop looking for someone else to save me and figure out how to save myself." The words should have stung, but instead they sent a thrill of something like recognition through her chest. "And how would you suggest I do that?" Joseph was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with something that might have been longing. "There are other ways to make a living in a place like this. Mrs. Patterson mentioned you're good with a needle. Folks around here are always needing things mended, altered, made new. Could be you don't need a husband to survive. Could be you just need to believe in yourself." Evangeline felt something shift inside her chest, like a door opening onto a room she'd never seen before. "You make it sound simple." "Simple doesn't mean easy." Joseph straightened, and suddenly he was looming over her, tall and solid and magnetic in a way that made her pulse race. "But maybe easier than tying yourself to a man who sees you as a solution to his problems, instead of a person worth knowing." The air between them seemed to crackle with electricity. Evangeline found herself taking a step closer, drawn by something she couldn't name. In the moonlight, Joseph's face was all shadows and sharp angles, beautiful in a way that made her chest tight. "You barely know me," she whispered. "How can you be so sure about what I should do?" His hand came up to cup her cheek, thumb tracing across her skin with reverent gentleness. "Because I recognize the look in your eyes. It's the same look I had when I walked away from the army. The look of someone who's tired of letting other people decide who they're supposed to be. If you're loving this tale so far, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. I'm working hard to reach 50 subscribers, and every single one of you makes a difference. Help me grow this channel. Now back to Evangeline." His touch was electric, sending shivers racing down her spine. Evangeline had been courted before, had even allowed a few chaste kisses from respectable suitors in Boston. But nothing had prepared her for this, the way her entire body seemed to come alive under Joseph's gentle touch, the way her heart hammered against her ribs as if it was trying to break free. "Joseph," she breathed, not even sure what she was asking for. His thumb traced the line of her lower lip, and she saw his control waver. "Evangeline," he said roughly, "you should go back inside. People will talk. I told you, let them talk." Instead of stepping away, she moved closer, until they were standing so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. The proper thing to do would be to return to the boarding house, to maintain appropriate distance from this man who wasn't her intended husband. But standing here in the moonlight with Joseph's hand on her face, propriety seemed like a concept from another lifetime. "This is dangerous," he murmured, but his other hand came up to frame her face, holding her like she was something precious. Everything worthwhile is dangerous. And then somehow they were kissing, and Evangeline discovered that all her previous experiences had been pale shadows of the real thing. Joseph's mouth was warm and demanding, and when she parted her lips in surprise, he groaned low in his throat and deepened the kiss until she was clinging to his shoulders for support. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. Evangeline's lips felt swollen and tender, and every nerve ending in her body was singing. "That was," she began, then stopped, because there weren't words for what that had been. "A mistake," Joseph finished, though his hands were still cradling her face and his eyes were dark with the same desire she could feel coursing through her own veins. "Was it?" she challenged. "It didn't feel like a mistake." He dropped his hands and took a step back, running one hand through his hair. "Evangeline, you're engaged to another man." "Am I?" The question surprised her even as she asked it. I came here to marry Thomas Mitchell, yes, but I've never met him, never made any promises to him, and from what you've told me, he's not exactly the man I thought I was agreeing to marry. Joseph's jaw tightened. That doesn't change the fact that people will expect you to go through with it. And it doesn't change the fact that being involved with me will make your life here a hell of a lot more complicated. Maybe I'm tired of doing what people expect. They stared at each other for a long moment, the air between them charged with unspoken possibilities. Finally, Joseph shook his head. You should think about this. Really think about it. Once you make certain choices, you can't take them back. I know. Evangeline pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders, suddenly aware of the cool night air. Will I see you tomorrow? Something that might have been relief flickered across his features. If you want to. I do. After he walked her back to the boarding house, Evangeline lay awake for hours staring at the ceiling and reliving every moment of their kiss. She had come to Copper Ridge expecting to begin a new life as Thomas Mitchell's wife. Instead, she found herself questioning everything she thought she wanted, and all because of a silent warrior who seemed to see straight through to her soul. The next morning brought harsh reality back into focus. Evangeline woke early and helped Mrs. Patterson prepare breakfast for the boarders, trying to ignore the speculative looks and whispered comments from some of the men who had witnessed her departure with Joseph the night before. After the breakfast dishes were cleared, Mrs. Patterson pulled her aside. I think it's time you went to see Tom Mitchell, she said gently. Whatever you decide about your future, you need to have that conversation first. It's only fair to both of you. Evangeline knew she was right, much as she dreaded the meeting. She changed into her best dress, a deep blue wool that brought out her eyes, and made her way to the Silver Dollar Saloon, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed her down the street. The Silver Dollar was exactly what she'd expected, dim, smoky, and reeking of stale beer and unwashed bodies. Several rough-looking men turned to stare as she pushed through the swinging doors, and she had to resist the urge to turn around and flee. Help you with something, miss? Asked the bartender, a thin man with graying hair and suspicious eyes. I'm looking for Thomas Mitchell. The bartender jerked his head toward a corner table. Back there, but I should warn you, he's not exactly at his best right now. Evangeline made her way through the maze of tables and chairs, trying not to breathe too deeply. In the corner, slumped over a table with his head in his hands, was a man she assumed must be her intended husband. Thomas Mitchell was younger than she'd expected, probably in his early 30s, with sandy brown hair and what might have been a handsome face when he wasn't gray with hangover and unshaven. His clothes were rumpled and stained, and there were several empty bottles on the table in front of him. Mr. Mitchell? She said quietly. He looked up with bloodshot eyes, squinting as if the dim saloon light was too bright. When his gaze focused on her, his expression went through several rapid changes, confusion, recognition, and then something that looked almost like panic. You're the girl from Boston, he said thickly. The seamstress. I am. Evangeline Washington. I arrived yesterday on the afternoon stage. Thomas struggled to sit up straighter, running a hand through his disheveled hair. Yesterday? Jesus. What day is it now? Tuesday, Mr. Mitchell. He winced. I meant to meet you, I did. Things got away from me a little bit. Evangeline pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, trying not to let her distaste show on her face. Perhaps we should talk about our arrangement. Right, yes, our arrangement. Thomas reached for one of the bottles on the table, then seemed to think better of it. Listen, Miss Washington, I should probably explain a few things. About my situation here. I'm listening. For the next 20 minutes, Thomas Mitchell laid out the full extent of his problems. The failed cattle deal, the mounting debts, the bank threatening foreclosure, his late wife, Sarah, who had died giving birth to their stillborn son, his drinking, which had started as a way to cope with grief and had gradually taken over his life. I know I'm not what you expected, he finished miserably. Hell, I'm not what I expected either, but I figured. I thought maybe if I had a wife again, someone to help me get back on track. You thought a wife would solve your problems, Evangeline said quietly. I guess I did. He finally met her eyes, and she saw that underneath the alcohol and self-pity, there was a decent man struggling to surface. That's not fair to you, is it? No, she said gently. It's not. They sat in silence for a while, both of them absorbing the reality of the situation. Finally, Thomas spoke again. I suppose you'll be wanting to head back to Boston now. I can't afford to pay for your ticket, but maybe if I talk to someone. Actually, Evangeline said, surprising herself, I think I might stay in Copper Ridge for a while. Mrs. Patterson has offered me work at the boarding house, and I've been thinking about starting a seamstress business. Thomas blinked at her in confusion. You want to stay, even though you're not the man you represented yourself to be in your letters? Yes. Evangeline stood up, smoothing down her skirt. But not as your wife, Mr. Mitchell. I think we both deserve better than a marriage based on mutual desperation. Relief and disappointment warred across Thomas's face. I'm sorry, he said quietly, for wasting your time, for not being honest in my letters. You seem like a fine woman. You deserve a man who can appreciate that. Thank you, Evangeline said sincerely. And Tom, you might want to think about getting some help with the drinking. Mrs. Patterson mentioned there's a doctor in town who's had success helping people with similar problems. She left him sitting at the table, staring into his empty bottle, and walked out of the Silver Dollar feeling lighter than she had since arriving in Copper Ridge. The conversation had been difficult, but it had also been liberating. For the first time in months, she felt like she was making her own choices instead of simply reacting to circumstances. The feeling lasted until she reached the boarding house and found Sheriff Henderson waiting for her on the front porch. Miss Washington, he said, touching his hat brim in a mockery of politeness. I heard you paid a visit to the Silver Dollar this morning. Hope everything worked out the way you wanted. There was something in his tone that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. My business with Mr. Mitchell is concluded, yes. Good, good. Henderson smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. So I reckon you'll be looking for a way back to Boston now. Unfortunate that things didn't work out, but probably for the best. Small town like this, sometimes folks just don't fit in. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Evangeline felt her temper rise, but she kept her voice level. Actually, Sheriff, I've decided to stay in Copper Ridge. I'll be working for Mrs. Patterson and starting my own seamstress business. Henderson's smile faltered. Is that so? Well, now that's interesting. You sure that's wise? Town like this can be hard on outsiders, especially ones who don't understand how things work around here. And how do things work around here, Sheriff? People stick to their own kind, Henderson said bluntly. Makes life easier for everyone. Less complicated. Before Evangeline could respond, she heard the sound of boots on the wooden sidewalk. She turned to see Joseph approaching, and the relief that flooded through her was so intense it was almost overwhelming. Sheriff, Joseph said quietly, nodding to Henderson. His eyes moved to Evangeline, taking in her tense posture and the sheriff's aggressive stance. Everything all right here? Just having a friendly chat with Miss Washington about her plans, Henderson said, his hand moving casually to rest on his gun belt. Nothing that concerns you. If it concerns Miss Washington, it concerns me. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Evangeline saw Henderson's face darken with anger, and she quickly stepped between the two men before the situation could escalate. Thank you both for your concern, she said firmly, but I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions about my future. Sheriff Henderson, I appreciate your advice, but I've decided to stay in Copper Ridge. Joseph, would you walk with me? I have some things I'd like to discuss. For a moment she thought Henderson might press the issue, but then he shrugged and stepped back. Your choice, miss. Just remember what I said about understanding how things work around here. He touched his hat brim again and walked away, but not before shooting Joseph a look that promised trouble. We're getting to the most intense part of the story. If you're hooked, show your support by hitting like and subscribe. Help me reach 50 subscribers so I can keep bringing you these passionate Western romances. Let's continue. Once Henderson was out of sight, Joseph turned to face her fully. "Are you all right? What did he want?" Evangeline realized her hands were shaking slightly, and she clasped them together to still them. He was making it clear that outsiders aren't welcome in Copper Ridge, at least not outsiders like me. Joseph's expression darkened. "Henderson's an ass, but he's not wrong about one thing. This town can be hard on people who don't fit their narrow idea of what's acceptable. Are you sure you want to stay?" "More sure than I've been about anything in a long time." Evangeline looked up at him, taking in the concern in his dark eyes, the way he held himself ready to fight for her if necessary. "I spoke with Thomas Mitchell this morning. We agreed to call off our engagement." Something shifted in Joseph's expression, surprise, relief, and something deeper that made her pulse quicken. "How do you feel about that?" "Free," she said simply. "For the first time in months, I feel free." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, heading toward the outskirts of town where the buildings gave way to open grassland and rolling hills. The Montana sky stretched endlessly above them, bigger than any sky Evangeline had ever seen, and she found herself thinking that perhaps this wild, rugged territory suited her better than the cramped, proper streets of Boston ever had. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Of course." "Last night you said you recognized the look in my eyes. The look of someone tired of letting other people decide who they're supposed to be. What did you mean by that?" Joseph was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, as if he was seeing something far away. "I spent 3 years scouting for the U.S. Army," he said. "Thought I was doing something important, helping to keep the peace between settlers and tribes. Took me way too long to realize that what they really wanted was someone to help them justify their actions. They'd ask me to track down hostile Indians, but half the time those hostiles were just families trying to protect their hunting grounds or their children." He stopped walking and turned to look out over the grassland, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "The final straw came when they ordered me to lead them to a Blackfoot village that had been raiding supply wagons. Turned out the raids were desperate attempts to get food for starving children. The army didn't care. They wanted blood, and they wanted me to help them spill it." Evangeline felt her heart clench at the pain in his voice. "What did you do?" "I led them in the wrong direction. Gave the village time to pack up and move to safer territory. Then I quit, came here, and tried to figure out how to live with myself." Joseph looked at her, and she saw years of guilt and regret in his dark eyes. "Point is, I spent too long being what other people wanted me to be instead of listening to what I knew was right. I won't make that mistake again." "Is that why you helped me? Because you saw someone making the same mistake?" "Maybe." Joseph reached out and touched her cheek, the same gentle caress that had undone her the night before. "Or maybe I helped you because the moment I saw you step off that stagecoach, I knew my life was about to change." The honesty in his voice took her breath away. Evangeline leaned into his touch, feeling something wild and desperate unfurl in her chest. "Joseph," she whispered, "what are we doing?" "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know I don't want to stop." This time when he kissed her, there was nothing hesitant about it. His mouth was hungry and demanding, and when she responded with equal fervor, he groaned and pulled her closer, until there was no space left between them. Evangeline could feel the rapid beating of his heart against her chest, could taste the wildness on his lips, and she thought dimly that this was what it meant to be truly alive. When they broke apart, both of them were trembling. Joseph rested his forehead against hers, his breathing ragged. "Evangeline," he said roughly, "if we keep doing this, there's no going back. Once the town knows about us, everything changes. Are you ready for that?" She thought about Sheriff Henderson's thinly veiled threats, about the disapproving stares she'd already received, about the life of propriety and respectability she was choosing to abandon. Then she looked into Joseph's eyes and saw her future reflected there, uncertain, dangerous, but blazingly real. "I'm ready," she said firmly. "The question is, are you ready to be with a woman who's going to cause you nothing but trouble?" Joseph's smile was fierce and beautiful. "Sweetheart, I've been looking for trouble my whole life. I just never knew it would have honey-colored eyes and a smile that could stop my heart." They spent the rest of the afternoon walking and talking, sharing stories of their pasts and dreams for the future. Joseph told her about his childhood on a Crow reservation, his years in white schools where he'd learned to speak perfect English and hide his heritage when necessary. Evangeline spoke about growing up in Philadelphia, the daughter of a free blacksmith and a seamstress, about the dreams she'd had to give up when her parents died and left her alone in the world. By the time they returned to town, the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and gold, and Evangeline felt like she'd known Joseph her entire life. More than that, she felt like she'd finally found the person she was meant to be. Not Thomas Mitchell's rescued mail-order bride. Not the proper Boston seamstress, but simply herself, complicated and imperfect and gloriously free. The next few weeks passed in a blur of hard work and stolen moments. True to her word, Mrs. Patterson put Evangeline to work at the boarding house, and word quickly spread about her skills with a needle. Soon she had more mending and alteration work than she could handle, and she began to envision a future where she truly was independent, beholden to no one. Joseph found excuses to visit the boarding house almost daily, sometimes bringing small jobs that needed Mrs. Patterson's attention, sometimes simply appearing at meal times with an offering of fresh fish or game. The other boarders gradually grew accustomed to his presence, though Evangeline was always aware of the speculative looks and whispered conversations that followed in their wake. Sheriff Henderson, meanwhile, made his disapproval increasingly clear. He found reasons to patrol past the boarding house more frequently, always tipping his hat with exaggerated politeness when he saw Evangeline, always letting his gaze linger on Joseph with poorly concealed hostility. The tension came to a head on a Thursday evening in late September. Evangeline was sitting on the front porch of the boarding house, taking advantage of the last good light to work on a dress commission, when Henderson appeared at the front gate. "Evening, Miss Washington," he said, dismounting from his horse. "Mind if I have a word?" Evangeline set down her sewing and stood up, every instinct telling her to be cautious. "Of course, Sheriff. What can I do for you?" Henderson climbed the front steps, moving with deliberate slowness that reminded her unpleasantly of a cat stalking prey. "I've been hearing some interesting stories around town, about you and that half-breed you've been keeping company with. If you have something to say, Sheriff, I suggest you say it plainly." "All right, I will." Henderson's mask of politeness finally slipped, revealing the ugly prejudice beneath. "You're making a fool of yourself, and you're making this town look bad in the process. Respectable folks don't appreciate seeing a colored woman parading around with an Indian like she's something special." Evangeline felt anger rise in her throat like bile, but she kept her voice level. "I'm not parading around with anyone, Sheriff. Joseph Crowfeather is my friend, and what we do together is our business." "Is it? Because the way I see it, you're both outsiders causing problems in my town, and I don't like problems. And what exactly do you propose to do about it?" Henderson smiled, and the expression made her skin crawl. "Well now, that depends on how reasonable you want to be. See, I've been thinking that maybe you'd be happier somewhere else, somewhere more suitable for someone of your particular circumstances." "You mean somewhere you don't have to see me?" "I mean somewhere you can be with your own kind, instead of corrupting decent white folks and encouraging that savage to forget his place." The words hit her like a physical blow, but before she could respond, she heard familiar footsteps on the wooden sidewalk. Joseph appeared around the corner of the house, carrying a basket of vegetables from Mrs. Patterson's garden, and his expression went deadly still when he saw Henderson. "Sheriff," he said quietly, setting down the basket, "is there a problem?" Henderson turned to face him, hand moving to rest on his gun. "Nothing you need to concern yourself with, boy. Just having a conversation with Miss Washington about her future plans." "I see." Joseph's voice was calm, but Evangeline could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands hung loose and ready at his sides. "And what did you conclude from this conversation?" "That some people need to learn their place in the world, and some people need to stop encouraging them to forget it." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Evangeline stepped forward, positioning herself between the two men before the situation could explode into violence. "Sheriff Henderson," she said firmly, "I want you to leave. Now." Henderson's face reddened. "You don't give me orders, girl. I'm the law in this town. And I'm a citizen who's broken no laws. You have no right to harass me on private property and no authority to dictate who I choose to associate with." For a moment, she thought Henderson might lose control entirely. His hand tightened on his gun, and she saw something dangerous flicker in his eyes. Then Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway behind them. "Sheriff Henderson," the older woman said coldly, "I believe Miss Washington asked you to leave. This is my property, and I'm asking you the same thing." The presence of a white woman seemed to deflate some of Henderson's aggression. He looked between Mrs. Patterson and Evangeline, then shot Joseph a look full of promised retribution. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "Not by a long shot." After he rode away, Evangeline found that her legs were shaking. Joseph reached out to steady her, his hands warm and strong on her arms. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said, though they all knew it wasn't entirely true. "Just angry." Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her face creased with concern. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that, dear. Tom Henderson's always been a small-minded man, but he's been getting worse lately. I think the town council needs to know about this." "No," Evangeline said quickly. "That will only make things worse. He'll just find other ways to cause trouble." Joseph was studying her face with worried eyes. "Evangeline, maybe you should think about what he said. Not because he's right," he added quickly, "but because he's dangerous. Men like Henderson don't make idle threats." "Are you suggesting I should leave Copper Ridge?" "I'm suggesting you should consider all your options. There are other towns, other places where people might be more accepting." "No." Evangeline pulled away from his hands, sudden fury giving her strength. "I am tired of running away from small-minded bullies. I ran away from Boston because I couldn't handle one man's unwanted attention. And I'll be damned if I'm going to run away from here because Tom Henderson doesn't like the color of my skin or the company I keep." "This is different," Joseph said urgently. "Henderson has real power here. He can make our lives hell if he wants to. Then we'll deal with it together." Evangeline reached out and took his hands, looking directly into his eyes. "Unless you're having second thoughts about being involved with someone who causes this much trouble." Joseph's grip on her hands tightened. "Never," he said fiercely. "But I need to know you understand what you're choosing. It's not going to be easy." "Nothing worthwhile ever is." Mrs. Patterson had been watching this exchange with interest, and now she cleared her throat. "If I may make a suggestion," she said carefully, "perhaps it's time you two made things official." Evangeline felt her heart skip a beat. "Official?" "Married," Mrs. Patterson said bluntly. "As long as you're just spending time together, Henderson and folks like him will see you as fair game. But marriage is a sacred institution, even to small-minded bigots. It might not stop the talk, but it would stop them from doing anything more active about it." Evangeline looked at Joseph, wondering what he was thinking. They'd known each other for less than a month, and while the connection between them was undeniable, marriage seemed like a huge step. "What do you think?" she asked quietly. Joseph's dark eyes searched her face. "I think," he said slowly, "that I've been falling in love with you since the moment you stepped off that stagecoach, and I think that if you'll have me, I'd be honored to call you my wife." The simple declaration took her breath away. "Joseph, I know it's fast," he said quickly, "and I know it's not the romantic proposal you probably dreamed about when you were a girl. But I also know that what we have is real and worth fighting for. The question is whether you feel the same way." Evangeline thought about everything that had brought her to this moment: the failed engagement to Thomas Mitchell, the threats from Sheriff Henderson, the way her entire life had been turned upside down in the space of a few weeks. Then she looked at Joseph, this quiet, strong man who had stood up for her, protected her, and shown her what it meant to be truly seen and valued. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." The smile that spread across Joseph's face was like sunrise, brilliant and transformative. He lifted her hands to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "When?" he asked. "As soon as possible," Mrs. Patterson interjected practically. "No point in giving Henderson time to cause more trouble. I'll speak to Reverend Williams tomorrow morning. He's a good man, and he won't refuse to marry you just because some people might not approve." That night, Evangeline lay awake staring at the ceiling and trying to process everything that had happened. In the span of a few hours, she had gone from an uncertain future to an engagement, to a man she'd known for less than a month. By all rights, she should be terrified. Instead, she felt a deep sense of rightness, as if all the scattered pieces of her life were finally falling into place. The wedding was held 3 days later in the small wooden church on the edge of town. Mrs. Patterson served as Evangeline's witness, while Joseph was supported by Tom Mitchell, who had sobered up enough to realize he owed them both an apology and a debt of gratitude. Reverend Williams performed the ceremony with quiet dignity, and if he had any reservations about marrying a black woman to a Native American man, he kept them to himself. The only other guests were a few of Mrs. Patterson's friends and some of the boarding house residents who had grown fond of Evangeline. Sheriff Henderson was notably absent, though Evangeline had spotted him watching from across the street when they entered the church. Evangeline wore her best dress, the blue wool she'd worn to meet Thomas Mitchell, with wildflowers in her hair that Joseph had picked that morning. Joseph wore a clean white shirt and dark trousers, with a beaded vest that had belonged to his grandfather. When they exchanged vows, his hands were warm and steady on hers, and his voice was strong and sure as he promised to love and protect her for the rest of his life. When Reverend Williams pronounced them husband and wife, Joseph's kiss was gentle and reverent, but Evangeline could feel the passion banked behind it, the promise of everything that would come later when they were alone. After the ceremony, Mrs. Patterson had arranged a small celebration at the boarding house, complete with cake and coffee and congratulations from the other residents. As the evening wore on, Evangeline found herself watching her new husband as he spoke quietly with Tom Mitchell, accepting the other man's thanks and apologies with typical grace. Thank you so much for reading, listening to this story. If you enjoyed it, please smash that like button and subscribe to help me reach my goal of 50 subscribers. Your support helps me create more amazing Western romance stories for you. What did you think of this story? Let me know in the comments below. Later, when the guests had departed and the dishes were cleared away, Joseph took her hand and led her outside into the cool autumn evening. They walked in comfortable silence through the quiet streets of Copper Ridge, past the general store and the saloon, past the church where they'd been married just hours before. "No regrets?" Joseph asked as they reached the small cabin he'd been renting on the outskirts of town. Evangeline looked up at her husband, taking in the strong line of his jaw, the way moonlight caught in his dark hair, the love and uncertainty warring in his eyes. "Only that it took us so long to get here," she said softly. Joseph's smile was tender and fierce all at once. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her wedding ring, a simple band of silver that had belonged to his mother. "Mrs. Crow Feather," he said, testing out the name. "Mrs. Crow Feather," she repeated, marveling at how right it sounded. Inside the cabin, Joseph had prepared everything for their wedding night. Candles flickered on the wooden table, casting warm light across the simple but clean rooms. Wildflowers, the same type she'd worn in her hair, sat in a jar by the window. "It's not much," Joseph said, suddenly seeming unsure of himself. "It's perfect," Evangeline assured him, and she meant it. After months of uncertainty and displacement, this small cabin felt more like home than anywhere she'd lived since her parents died. They came together slowly, tenderly, learning each other's bodies with reverent hands and whispered endearments. When Joseph finally made her truly his wife in every sense of the word, Evangeline thought she had never felt more complete, more perfectly herself than she did in that moment wrapped in his arms. Afterward, they lay entwined beneath handmade quilts, talking quietly about their hopes and dreams for the future. "I want to build something here," Joseph said, tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. Not just for us, but for other people who need a place where they can be themselves without apology. What do you mean? I've been thinking about buying some land, maybe starting a ranch. But not just any ranch. A place where people like us can work and live without having to worry about folks like Henderson. Mixed-race couples, Indians who don't want to live on reservations, freed slaves looking for a new start, anyone who needs a second chance. Evangeline propped herself up on her elbow to look at him, her heart swelling with love and admiration. That sounds wonderful, and impossible, and exactly like something you would think of. Joseph grinned. You think it's crazy. I think it's brilliant, and I think we should start planning immediately. They talked long into the night about logistics and possibilities, about how they might make such a dream reality. When Evangeline finally fell asleep in her husband's arms, she dreamed of vast grasslands and thriving communities, of children playing safely in the sunshine while their parents built lives free from prejudice and fear. The first test of their marriage came sooner than either of them expected. 2 weeks after the wedding, Evangeline was working in Mrs. Patterson's garden when Sheriff Henderson appeared with 2 deputies in tow. "Mrs. Crow Feather," he said with exaggerated politeness, "I need to speak with your husband." "He's at the livery stable," she replied carefully. "May I ask what this is about?" "Official business. There was a theft last night. Someone broke into the bank and made off with about $300. Funny thing is, the only witness said they saw an Indian man leaving the area around the time it happened." Evangeline felt ice form in the pit of her stomach. "And you naturally assumed it was Joseph." "I'm just following up on leads, ma'am. I'm sure it's all just a misunderstanding." But the smile on Henderson's face told her it was anything but a misunderstanding. This was exactly the kind of trouble he'd been waiting for. A chance to remove Joseph from the picture permanently. "Sheriff Henderson," she said carefully, "my husband was home with me all last night. We can provide witnesses if necessary." "That's so. Well, we'll just have to see about that, won't we?" 20 minutes later, Henderson and his deputies had arrested Joseph on suspicion of bank robbery. Despite Evangeline's protests and Mrs. Patterson's testimony that they had both been at the boarding house until well past midnight, they hauled him away in shackles. "Don't worry," Joseph called to her as they loaded him into a wagon. "This is Henderson's way of trying to get rid of me, but it won't work. The truth will come out." Evangeline wasn't so sure. In a town where the sheriff was corrupt and racial prejudice ran deep, the truth was whatever people wanted it to be. She spent the next 3 days gathering evidence and witnesses, calling in every favor she could. Mrs. Patterson helped, as did Tom Mitchell, who seemed determined to make up for his earlier failures. Even some of the boarding house residents who had initially been skeptical of Joseph came forward to testify to his character. But the real break came from an unexpected source. On the 4th day of Joseph's imprisonment, a young cowboy named Billy Morrison came to the boarding house looking for Evangeline. Billy worked for one of the smaller ranches outside town, and he looked nervous and scared as Mrs. Patterson showed him into the parlor. "Ma'am," he said, twisting his hat in his hands, "I heard about your husband being arrested and I think there's something you should know." Evangeline leaned forward, hardly daring to hope. "What is it, Billy?" "I was in town the night the bank got robbed. I'd been drinking pretty heavy and I was walking back to my horse when I saw someone coming out of the alley behind the bank. It was dark, but I got a good look at him when he passed under the street lamp. And," Billy took a deep breath, "it wasn't your husband, ma'am. It was Jake Garrett. You know, that fella who was giving you trouble at dinner a while back. I'm sure of it." Evangeline's heart leaped. Jake Garrett was the same man who had made racist comments about Joseph at the boarding house dinner table. "Billy, would you be willing to testify to that?" The young cowboy hesitated. "Ma'am, Garrett's got friends in this town. If I speak up against him—" "I understand you're scared," Evangeline said gently, "but an innocent man is sitting in jail right now because people are too afraid to tell the truth. Is that the kind of town you want to live in?" Billy was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with his conscience. Finally, he nodded. "You're right, ma'am. I'll testify." The trial was held the next day in the town's small courthouse with Judge Harrison presiding. Henderson had clearly expected it to be a formality. Present his flimsy evidence, get a quick conviction, and rid himself of a problem. He wasn't prepared for the parade of witnesses who testified to Joseph's character and whereabouts on the night in question. He certainly wasn't prepared for Billy Morrison's bombshell testimony identifying Jake Garrett as the real thief. When Garrett was arrested on the spot and quickly confessed under pressure, Henderson's face went purple with rage. Joseph was immediately released, but everyone in the courtroom understood that this was only a temporary victory. Outside the courthouse, Joseph pulled Evangeline into his arms, holding her tightly as if he couldn't quite believe he was free. "I thought," she began, then stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "I know," he murmured into her hair. "I thought so too. What happens now?" Joseph pulled back to look at her, his expression serious. "Now we get out of Copper Ridge before Henderson finds another excuse to come after us." Evangeline felt her heart sink. After everything they'd been through, everything they'd built, they were going to have to run after all. "Unless," Joseph continued, "you're willing to take a bigger risk." "What do you mean?" "I mean we stop playing defense and start playing offense. I've been talking to some of the other folks around here who are tired of Henderson's bullying. Tom Mitchell, Billy Morrison, even some of the business owners who are afraid to speak up. We could organize them, maybe even get Henderson voted out of office." Evangeline stared at him. "You want to take on the entire corrupt power structure of this town. I want to build the kind of place where our children can grow up free," Joseph said simply. "The kind of place where people like us don't have to keep looking over our shoulders." It was ambitious to the point of being foolhardy. It was dangerous, uncertain, and likely to make them even more enemies than they already had. It was also exactly what Evangeline had been hoping for without even knowing it. "All right," she said firmly. "Let's do it." The campaign to reform Copper Ridge took the better part of a year, but it was ultimately successful. Henderson was voted out of office and replaced by Billy Morrison, who had found his courage and decided to use it. Tom Mitchell, sober now and determined to make amends for his past mistakes, was elected to the town council. Evangeline's seamstress business thrived, and she and Joseph used the profits to buy a small ranch just outside town. True to their wedding night dreams, they began taking in people who needed a fresh start. Former slaves, displaced Indians, mixed-race couples, anyone who was willing to work hard and treat others with respect. On a warm evening in early summer, as they sat on the porch of their ranch house watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Joseph reached over and took Evangeline's hand. "Any regrets?" he asked, echoing the question he'd posed on their wedding night. Evangeline looked out over their land, where a dozen different families were building new lives free from persecution and fear. She thought about the long journey that had brought her here, from Boston to a mail-order bride advertisement, to a failed engagement, to a love she'd never imagined possible. "Only that it took me so long to find my way to you," she said, squeezing his hand. Joseph brought her fingers to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to the silver band that marked her as his wife. "Good thing I'm a patient man. Good thing I'm a stubborn woman." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Two people who had found in each other not just love, but the courage to build the kind of life they'd always dreamed of. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of their extended family, laughter from the bunkhouse where the single men lived, a woman singing as she put her children to bed, someone playing a guitar by the campfire. "What are you thinking about?" Joseph asked. "The future," Evangeline said. "Our children, our grandchildren, the world we're building for them." And I think they're going to be just fine." Joseph smiled and pulled her closer, and Evangeline thought that this moment, this man, this life they'd built together against all odds, was worth every risk they'd taken to get here. As the first star appeared in the darkening sky, she made a wish for the future, for the love that had transformed her from a desperate mail-order bride into a woman who knew her own worth and wasn't afraid to fight for it. And in Joseph's arms, with their dreams spreading out around them like a promise, she knew that wish was already coming true.